Well, I thought last week there were 41 verses of the gospel, so I thought 2 verses this week would help offset that a little bit. Let me begin by asking a question. How did you do on your homework? By the blank faces that I see before me, I'm guessing you don't know what I'm talking about. So here's another question. Who can remember where you were on July 22nd of 2012? I'll give you a hint. It was a Sunday. So you were probably here, listening to a brilliant sermon on this very gospel reading. If you were here, you would have heard a sermon preached on that. The title of the sermon was Come With Me. And at the end of the sermon, this is what I said. To end this morning, I will give you some homework. It's pay-up time. I'll give you some homework. Wednesday morning, go with Jesus to a quiet place. Remember, the key to good rest is to plan for it. So sometime in the midst of your Wednesday morning routine, have the intentional desire to remove yourself from the tasks and distractions and focus on Jesus. The key is to hear that invitation and follow him to that place. Can you remember how you did? Can you remember if you took some time on that Wednesday to spend some time in solitude with Jesus? That's what we're looking at today. We're looking at the spiritual practice of solitude, which is the act of retreating away from the hyper-frenzy of life in order to cultivate our spiritual lives. We retreat away from the busyness, the activity, and the routine in order to dive more deeply into an intimate connection with our Lord. And these 2 verses that we read this morning speak to that very important invitation that Christ gives us for that purpose. Jesus invites the disciples to retreat, to go to a solitary place. And he invites us to do the same. So I'd invite you to pick up your pew Bibles and turn to Mark chapter 6. Now, often when we think about solitude, we think about the act of being alone. After all, that's kind of what the word literally means, the state of being alone. However, so often we look at this term negatively. We think of seclusion or we think of isolation. One definition that I read for solitude actually read this: a lonely and unfrequented place. It emphasizes the quality of being or feeling lonely or deserted. Well, that doesn't really make us want to enter that place as a spiritual discipline, does it? Doesn't make it a really attractive thing to think about. Kind of sounds more like punishment, kind of like solitary confinement. But so often is the case, the way that the Bible talks about solitude in a spiritual practice kind of way is different than the popular usage. Because solitude is not simply the act of being alone or being by yourself. Solitude is being alone with Jesus. Jesus says in our gospel reading, "Come with me by yourselves." That's what solitude is. It's going away with Jesus by yourself. And notice that Jesus makes this invitation in response to the craziness of the crowds around them. This passage is quite interesting because just before it, you hear about the death of John the Baptist. But at the beginning of chapter 6, you hear about the disciples being sent on a mission. So they go out, they go 2 by 2, they go out with the task to preach and to heal and to do all sorts of great stuff. And they go out doing that. And while we don't really know how long they were gone for, we gather that there was a little bit of a passage of time. Right? As I said, we hear about the imprisonment and the death of John the Baptist before they get back. Our reading starts at verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had seen and done. There were stories that they wanted to relate to Jesus. There were events that they wanted to talk about. There were probably questions that they wanted to ask. The disciples returned from their mission desiring to connect with Jesus, but there was a problem, and it was the crowds. The crowds got in the way. The crowd of people is described as coming and going, so much so that they couldn't even eat. Like, it was this frenetic scene. And I was thinking about a wonderful image for this. How would we picture this today? Think about cross-iron mills on Boxing Day, right? I think that's what's going on. The marketing director of Cross-Iron Mills reported that on December 26th of 2013, over 73,000 shoppers came to the mall on that one day. It opened at 8 in the morning and then closed at 7 p.m. And it means that on that day, there were more people found in the mall than in Airdrie. That's what that means. So how else can you describe that scene as people are coming and going and they're bumping into you and they're cutting you off, and it's noisy and it's stuffy and it's hot and it's uncomfortable? Imagine going into the food court for some food. You have no hope, no chance to eat. It would be hot, it'd be noisy, it'd be chaotic. Albeit on a smaller scale, that's the same dynamic that's occurring here. The word of Jesus had spread around, and people are making their way to him. They're trying to get to him. They're coming and going, and they're cutting people off, and they're bumping into each other. And all this commotion is making it impossible for the disciples to connect with Jesus. Sometimes life can be overly busy. Things are thrown at us from every which way. There is a sense of franticness to it all, as one thing piles upon another, one after the other. We move constantly from one thing to the other, from one task to another task. We hold multiple conversations at the same time. And when we move on to something, often we're thinking about what we've moved on from, the decision that we've just made or the conversations that we've just had. And again, we're also thinking about the things that we need to do that's coming up a little bit more quickly than we would like. Did you know that according to a study published in February of 2013, that the average cell phone user checks their phone around 150 times per day? Now, that's not a 24-hour period of time. That's based on 16 hours being awake, which means that the average cell phone user checks their cell phone, once every 6 minutes. And there's always something to look at. There's always something to listen to. There's always some conversation to have. And if you're not looking at that thing, if you're not having that conversation, if you're not plugged into what the latest news is, you're missing it. And it causes some stress. There's stress around feeling that you need to respond to every email as soon as it comes in, or every text that you see, that you need to pounce on everything on your radar. Another study, which was done by the American Psychological Association, showed that across all demographics, all age demographics, people are living with a higher level of stress than before, and then it's healthy. Those between the ages of 18 and 33 report the highest level of stress and the lowest levels of relief among all age groups. People are dealing with a whole lot of stuff. And it's not just the busyness of life, the fast-paced manner that this world is constantly changing. It's the pressure, it's the demands, it's the decisions, it's the feelings of being utterly overwhelmed by all things that come down the funnel aiming at us. And all of that crowds around us and has the nasty habit of getting in the way of our connection with God. See, the disciples, they want to be connected. They have this desire to meet with Jesus, to share, to unload, to ask, to question. But the whirlwind of the day seems to make that impossible for them. Maybe you found yourself in that place. Maybe you've found yourself in that place where you say, it's great to think about prayer and Bible reading and meditation and all this kind of stuff. I just don't have the time. If there were 29 hours